Street Fighter 30th Anniversary Collection. 12 Street Fighter games, all in one place. So we're gonna do this column by column, starting with Street Fighter 1, on to Street Fighter 2 and its variants, the Street Fighter Alpha series, and then finally, Street Fighter 3 and its variants. I know at times that means we're not going in order of release. And you might notice some footage where I'm playing really bad. That's because I tried to use characters I don't normally use to keep things interesting. But anyway, we're gonna start with a game where you don't have a choice of character. Street Fighter. And here we have the prototypical fighting game. Originally, these machines in arcades actually had pressure-sensitive buttons, and those were very prone to breaking, so you'll very rarely see one of those machines now. I played on one exactly once as a child. The machine had been there for less than a week, and the buttons were already having issues. And while this is easily the weakest game in the collection, you can definitely see the potential that was here. It just needed refinement. The health bars needed moved, the action needed to become a little smoother. But one thing I do like about this game is that special moves are much harder to pull off. And if you do manage to pull one off, it does a ton of damage. Literally 3 special moves is enough to end any of the fights here. Interestingly, most of the characters here would not return for Street Fighter 2. Some of them would, however, come back in Street Fighter Alpha. This game is something of a relic, and not really worth playing today. But anyway, on to its much more famed sequel, Street Fighter 2. Now, usually playing this, it feels very slow compared to more modern fighting games. But after playing Street Fighter 1, this feels so fast and so smooth. Now, I played a ton of this in arcades, and of course, on the Super Nintendo. And this game led to a big boom in fighting games in the 90s, with a huge number of games that wanted to be Street Fighter 2, but with a twist of some kind. And the vast majority of them were just terrible. This was also the first arcade cabinet that I was very aware that I was seeing bootleg versions of at places. You'd see a Street Fighter 2 cabinet that looked just a little off and it would say Street Fighter 2 Rainbow Edition, or have some weird subtitle on it, Street Fighter 2 Fight Harder. And if you actually played one, they were sorta like playing Street Fighter 2, usually faster, and usually incredibly glitchy and even prone to crashing in some instances. And some people would think these were real, because there were a lot of variations on Street Fighter 2. Starting with Street Fighter 2 Champion Edition. And the big change here is that you can now play as the 4 boss characters in addition to the original 8. This also allowed both players to choose the same character. You couldn't do that in the original. And of course, when I played this, I immediately thought, well, it's better to play as the boss characters, right? Except, as a kid, I didn't know how to play these characters, so I pretty much immediately ended up losing. It was nice to have these characters as playable, though, as when playing the original Street Fighter 2, I remember being shocked that there were more characters to fight after you beat the 8 playable characters. This, of course, led to a lot of rumors about other hidden characters in the game, none of which turned out to be true. Other than that, this plays about the same as vanilla Street Fighter 2. There are a few balance tweaks that snuck in this version, but the speed of the game and the precision required for things was about the same here as the original. Then came along Street Fighter 2 Turbo Hyper Fighting. This greatly increased the speed of everything, and as a side effect made it so special moves had to be a little more precise. And this is also the first game in this collection that will feel something like a modern fighting game. There were a lot of graphical tweaks here, as well as some of the characters receiving new special moves. I remember at the time thinking, okay, we've added more playable characters, and now we've made the game considerably faster. Surely this is the final refinement on Street Fighter 2. Of course not, because next comes Street Fighter 2 The New Challengers, adding 4 more characters, and updating some of the sprites used, but not all of them. And boy, did the characters using the old sprites really stand out next to the newer ones. This edition also slowed things back down, which is the decision I was confused by back then, and am still today not sure why was made. The new characters are an interesting addition, although I personally was never a big fan of most of them. I will say though that the sprite work on these new characters is top-notch, and the final version of Street Fighter II in this collection is Street Fighter II Turbo, which is often confused with Street Fighter II Hyper Fighting. This game actually came with adjustable speed, so it could be as fast as Hyper Fighting, or slowed down to the original, though it's better when it's faster. This was the first game to have super meters, which when full allowed you to do a super combo. It was also the first version of Street Fighter to actually have a hidden character, in the form of Akuma, which unfortunately I was not able to unlock. You could also play as earlier versions of the characters without the super meters, though I'm honestly not sure why you would do that or what the point of that would even be. Nowadays, if you see a Street Fighter II machine out in the wilds anywhere, it's probably going to be Street Fighter II Turbo. And thankfully, we can finally move on to a game that's not Street Fighter II. Street Fighter Alpha, the start of a sub-series to the Street Fighter franchise, taking place between the events of Street Fighter I and Street Fighter II, also including characters from the Final Fight franchise. This expanded the Super Combo system. It also gave you the option to play in normal or auto. Auto made Super Combos easier to pull off, as well as automatically had your character blocking in certain circumstances. I played quite a bit of this on the PlayStation 1, but not so much in arcades. As in this collection it's the arcade version, I'm definitely noticing that the sprite work is a lot more fluid in this version than the PlayStation version. This game also had 2 secret characters. Akuma comes back for this game, but far more importantly, the greatest character in the entire Street Fighter franchise made his debut here as a secret character. That's right, I'm talking about Dan. You could also unlock M. Bison, but honestly, who cares? Sadly, despite my best attempts, I couldn't actually get these characters to unlock. I am not entirely sure what it is I was doing wrong. But anyway, on to Street Fighter Alpha 2, where you don't have to do anything to unlock Akuma and Dan and M. Bison, because they're already selectable right away. And in terms of secret characters, they're more alternate versions of characters, like Evil Ryu and Shin Akuma, and a few others. Really, this is just a bigger, better version of Street Fighter Alpha 1. You get a couple more of your classic characters, a couple more from Final Fight, and one new original character. I never actually saw an arcade cabinet of this back in the day. In fact, I wouldn't see one till almost a decade after the fact. But I did have a lot of fun playing the PlayStation version. Truthfully, I wish I could have seen the arcade version back then, but I probably saved a lot of money not seeing one. Speaking of arcade cabinets I didn't see in person at the time, Street Fighter Alpha 3, which actually I didn't have any experience with until on the PSP. And apparently the roster of characters in this one shifted in each release of Street Fighter Alpha 3. So this arcade version has considerably fewer characters than I was expecting. But anyway, Street Fighter Alpha 3 does change some things. Normal mode is now called A-ism, auto mode is now called X-ism, and there's now a new mode called V-ism. V-ism stands for Variable Mode. It allows you to use the custom combos from Street Fighter Alpha 2, but none of your regular super combos, which is interesting, but also not my style. They also added a power guard gauge. Each time it's completely emptied, it comes back a little smaller. I think this was pretty obviously put in here to punish overly defensive players. There was a variation of this released in the arcade, Street Fighter Alpha 3 Upper, but it is unavailable in this collection. There are a lot of little changes to the gameplay here, and I'm not really sure I like this over Street Fighter Alpha 2, at least in this collection. I might feel differently if the PSP version were on offer here, but sadly, it is not. And now on to Street Fighter 3, which actually released before Street Fighter Alpha 3, but honestly, I had no idea this had released at the time. Before this collection, I'd never played Street Fighter 3, or Street Fighter 3 Second Impact. My only experience with Street Fighter 3 wouldn't be until 2004, when I played the PlayStation 2 version of Street Fighter 3 Third Strike. But we'll get to that experience a bit later. So, Street Fighter 3. It got rid of aerial blocking that was in the Alpha series. It added dashing and various jump mechanics, like quick recovery. It gave you the chance to pick your super art, which can be an issue if you forget which art you chose. But you can only perform your super art after you've done a bunch of regular special moves, and I realize how oxymoronic that statement sounds. I was legitimately surprised by how small the roster of this game was, as the Alpha roster got pretty huge by the end, and only having knowledge of Third Strike before this, I was used to a much bigger roster in my Street Fighter 3. But here you have Kin and Ryu, and then a bunch of new characters, which honestly strikes me as an odd choice, and one that didn't change very much with the later iterations of Street Fighter 3. Maybe it was due to playing Street Fighter Alpha 1 through 3 before this. I didn't quite find my groove when I was playing this game. It seemed like I was screwing up a lot of the moves here, which I usually have no trouble pulling off. And admittedly, some of it was that not everything from Third Strike was available in this first incarnation of Street Fighter 3. Still, it was interesting to see the original version of this game, which is very similar to my feelings on Street Fighter 3 Second Impact. This is where EX special moves comes in, where you can do a better version of a special move by using some of your super gauge, and sometimes you'll end up doing that by complete accident. Yoon and Yang now have different movesets. Apparently only Kin and Ryu are allowed to copy one another. 3 more characters are on the roster this time. Akuma shows up, because why not? Urien, who has some relation to the big bad of Street Fighter 3. And everybody's favorite Andre the Giant impersonator, Hugo. In addition to the characters, you also get taunts in this version, and an ability to counter throws. Because we all know one guy who plays these games and only does throws. You can really see the progression from the original version of Street Fighter 3 here. But the fact that Third Strike exists kind of makes this version superfluous in my opinion. Speaking of which, Street Fighter 3 Third Strike. I did have some experience playing this on the PlayStation 2. I didn't personally own it, but a friend of mine did, and he had delusions that he was going to be a professional player. Despite him playing this game with literally every spare moment he had, he was easily the worst player in our group of friends. He did, however, enter one tournament, and came in last. Time and money well spent. But anyway, we get 5 more characters here, including series regular Chun-Li. In addition to that, we have the ability to do guard parries. You know you did these right when your character turns red. I am not good at doing them. You also get graded after every match. So if you're taking things too seriously, you can still feel bad even when you win. Really, if you're inclined to play Street Fighter 3, I think you should just stick with this version, don't bother with the earlier 2. Although personally, I prefer the Street Fighter Alpha series overall. Playing this collection was a very weird experience. I'd never sat down and played different versions of Street Fighter one after the other before, and it is interesting to see how the series grew after a very rough start. I personally think there's a few too many versions of Street Fighter 2 in this collection. I think you could have thrown at least one of those out to have one of the Street Fighter EX games in here, but even with that complaint, this is a great collection if you're a fan of fighting games, as the Street Fighter series has had a huge impact on the genre of fighting games. It might be even the most influential on that genre, though there's a conversation to have there to be sure. Hopefully the next compilation release that I do this to will have a little more genre diversity than this one did. But in fairness, it was called the Street Fighter Anniversary Collection, so they could have thrown Street Fighter 2010 into this collection. I'm sure it's an inclusion that absolutely no one would have wanted, but still, they hypothetically could have done it. It's called Street Fighter 2010 after all. Please do subscribe, comment, like, and tell your friends.